Middle Way Philosophy, Introductory Video, number 7a, Relativism, Why the Middle Way is Not Relativist, by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 7 on ethics. If you lived in 19th century China, where binding the feet of girl children was an accepted institution, would that be right for you in that context? Or if you lived in a society where slavery was the norm, would it be right for you to punish a slave for disobeying the norms of that society? Would it be right for you to buy and sell slaves, which is what people normally do? Would there need to be a reason beyond the fact that this is what people in your group and your society do? Does there need to be a reason beyond that for acting in one way rather than another? These are all the issues raised by the problem of relativism in ethics. Middle way philosophy seeks a more adequate position in between absolutism on the one hand and relativism on the other. In between the belief that people who practiced slavery or foot binding, for example, were simply wrong on the one hand, as absolutism, or the belief that it was right for them and there was no moral responsibility beyond that on the other, which is relativism. The middle way is not simply a compromise between any two identifiable extremes that might simply be conventional extremes. Rather, in each case, we need to identify clearly a positive and a negative absolute between which the middle way is found. So in this case, the positive absolute is what's known as moral absolutism, and the negative absolute is usually what's known as relativism. But we do have to be careful here in thinking about what do we mean by relativism. Absolutism here involves a known truth. That is, people who are absolutists believe that they've got a form of words that in some way represents reality as it is. Opposed to that, if you're going to have a correct opposite, a negative absolute, is a known falsehood. That is, a relativist in the sense we're talking about is somebody who believes clearly that there is no moral truth. There is not some right or wrong way to act in a particular circumstance. In between the belief in a known moral truth and the belief in a known moral falsehood, there's a third option. That is simply the acknowledgement that the moral truth, the ultimate moral truth, is unknown. It's very important to distinguish that third option from relativism as known falsehood, just as it's important in many other cases in the middle way to distinguish the agnostic option, the recognition of the unknown, from the denial option, the claim of a known falsehood. The term relativism in this case is sometimes used to refer to the unknown. The test of what is intended when the word relativism is used depends on what it's taken to imply, how the idea is then used. We have to look at it in context, rather than simply assuming when the word relativism is used that it means one thing or the other. There are a number of different types and forms of relativism. One distinction to start with is between epistemological, moral and aesthetic relativism. Epistemological relativism is the belief that there are different alternative truths, a term that's acquired a new resonance recently in political discourse. Moral relativism is the belief we've already mentioned, that there are different moral truths in different circumstances. Aesthetic relativism is the belief that there are different kinds of beauty in different circumstances. Although I'm concentrating mainly on moral relativism here, really exactly the same arguments apply to epistemological and aesthetic relativism. There's also relativism of time and place, relativism of culture, even relativism of individuals. This just involves distinctions between different times or different places. Is the right ethics the right way of living or behaving different at different times, so that we should not use the same standards that we have today when judging somebody who lived in the Middle Ages, for example? Should it apply to different places? So should we judge somebody's actions in China today differently from somebody who lives in France today? Whenever we make these kinds of distinctions, though, the same basic problems arise. And one of them is, how do you distinguish what is a unit where the relative judgment applies? Are we talking about countries here? Are we talking about subcultures? Are we talking about individual groups? Or even individual people? Do you have your own culture? Is each moment a separate time where a separate kind of judgment can be made? There are a huge number of conceptual problems which arise once you start taking relativism seriously. Another distinction that's often made is between descriptive relativism and normative relativism. Some philosophers think that's an important distinction. In practice, I don't think it has any particular relevance, because in practice, whenever we make any kind of supposed factual claim, it also involves values. And whenever we make any kind of value claim, it also necessarily involves assumed facts. So really, relativism is relativism, whether it's claimed to be descriptive or normative. Finally, there's a distinction between relativism of truth and relativism of justification. Now that's an important distinction to understand the case I want to make here about relativism and why the middle way is not relativism. Relativism of truth focuses on how things are supposed to be and the language we use to represent how things are supposed to be. The relativism of truth ends up saying that there are different truths for different people. There's my truth and your truth and their truth and someone else's truth. And because different people have arrived at those truths in different ways, therefore they're like separate islands. There's no bridging between them. In which case, if you're stuck on the idea of truth in this way, then it seems that relativism is inevitable. But this whole way of thinking rests on the assumption that there can be a truth, that we can express truth in language, or indeed that we can express falsehood in language, which, if you take embodied meaning seriously, is really not the case. So instead, we can think in terms of justification, which is probably a lot more useful. Rather than thinking in terms of separate truths for separate people, when we never had a truth in the first place, we can think in terms of judgments and justifications. It doesn't follow just because we can't reach an ultimate truth that's universal for everybody, that therefore any one judgment is just as good as any other judgment. So there can be a relativism of truth without a relativism of justification. And the idea of there being justifications that are better than other justifications relies on understanding universality in a helpful way. Universality is often thought of as some kind of absolute position. But if you think about the experience of embodied beings when they encounter each other, that can indicate a kind of universality which is not absolute in nature. Think about two people of completely different cultures who don't even speak the same language. How do they communicate with each other? Well, in the end, it depends on their shared humanity, the fact that they're both human. There are certain ways in which, however different they may be in background, they share the same kind of human body. They share the same shape of body, the same functions of their body, the same structure of their brains. That enables them, through whatever gestures, whatever kinds of expressions they use, they are able to communicate. You can even go further and suggest that there is a kind of confidence, perhaps a kind of intuitive moral sense, which can be communicated in that way. For that reason, then, we can't affirm a universality of truth. That would be absolutism, and that would take us back to the duality of the relationship between the positive absolute and the negative absolute. But we can affirm another kind of universality, a universality of justification, which depends on that kind of embodied universality. So, universality, far from depending on absolute beliefs, depends instead actually on particularity, because particularity is an aspect of embodied experience. The more adequately we can experience the kind of basis of confidence that we might hold in common with other people, the closer to universality we get, the more meaningful that universality becomes. So let's try to think about the implications of this middle way approach to absolutism and relativism by thinking about one of the moral examples I started with, the example of slavery and our moral judgments in relation to those who have practiced slavery in the past or in other cultures. In relation to that situation, let's first clarify the extremes. So absolutism in relation to our attitudes to people who practiced slavery in the past would mean that people who exploited slaves were wrong to do so. Or, if you really believe it, that they were right to do so. The other extreme, relativism, would be that slavery was right for them in the culture of their time and their place, even if it's wrong for us now in our culture and our time and place. In between those two extremes, there is a middle way. And that middle way takes into account the context of slavery being accepted. That's the embodied concept where the people who owned and sold and bought slaves existed. But nevertheless, in that context, people could make better or worse judgments. They are still subject to moral judgment. They can do things better or worse. But we can't make judgments about what's better or worse for them without taking into account that context. We need here to always think of our judgments and others' judgments as taking place at particular points in time, or particular points in the succession of their judgments through time. That means we avoid thinking of those judgments in a totally timeless way, an abstracted way. It's not that it's wrong for them to do or not to do such a thing at any time whatsoever. In fact, it's not totally wrong or totally right at all. That's absolute language. But nevertheless, it's better or worse to make a particular sort of choice at the time you are in the place you are in. The way we assess our judgments as better or worse needs to take into account, as much as we can, the conditions in which those judgments were made. Not that those conditions entirely decide the judgment, but simply that they provide the circumstances in which it took place, in which it can be understood. So individual conditions are basically the conditions of our bodies, but that can also be understood as psychological conditions, so the conditions of our particular brain or mind and the ways in which we are inclined to think and have thought up to that point, which will of course have a big effect on how we think subsequently. There are also social conditions, such as those of slavery, where people have certain expectations, which of course have a big effect on the way we think throughout our lives. But whatever those conditions, we still have choices because we experience choices. just as we experience conditions. We don't have to think in terms of determinism, that is, that we can't help what we do because of the conditions, nor do we have to think in terms of pure free will, that we have a choice regardless of those conditions. We have a choice in those conditions, a choice which is only understood in terms of the experience of choosing. So, to summarise why the middle way is not relativist. Relativism can be interpreted as denying absolute claims, or more charitably, if you want to think of it in the best possible way, or interpret what relativism means in the best possible way, as recognising the unknowability of absolute claims. As long as you distinguish those two interpretations clearly, it doesn't matter that much what relativism means. But the test of what people mean by relativism in practice is the assumptions they then go on to make, the judgments that they make from a relativist position or an anti-relativist position. So don't just make assumptions on the basis of the fact that people use the term relativism without seeing how they use it. The relativism of truth is unhelpful because it continues absolutist assumptions which in the end depend on the belief in truth or our access to truth. The universality of justification, on the other hand, depends on taking particular circumstances into account. It doesn't depend on absolutism. It doesn't depend on being able to represent reality in words. Rather, it depends on experiencing a degree of universality. The middle way takes the particular circumstances of an individual into account. But nevertheless, some judgments in those particular circumstances are better than others. You can also link that idea of some judgments being better than others with the integration of the person making the judgment. For more on that, see the videos on integration in this series.